From our nation's capital, welcome to America's Drug Forum. I'm Randy Page. We depart today from our normal format to take the opportunity to speak at length with one of the nation's most influential thinkers of the 20th century, Professor Milton Friedman. Professor Friedman was the 1976 Nobel Prize recipient for economic science. He's a former economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and among his many lists of accomplishments, most recently he is the recipient of the 1991 Richard Dennis Drug Peace Award for his consistent and controversial call for drug policy reform. Professor Friedman, thanks for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
Let us deal first with the issue of legalization of drugs. How do you see America changing for the better under that system?
I see America with half the number of prisons, half the number of prisoners, 10,000 fewer homicides a year, inner cities in which there's a chance for these poor people to live without being afraid for their lives, respectable citizens who are now citizens who might be respectable who are now addicts, not being subject to becoming criminals in order to get their drug, being able to get drugs for which they're sure of the quality. You know, the same thing happened under prohibition of alcohol as is happening now. Under prohibition of alcohol, deaths from alcohol poisoning, from poisoning by things that were mixed in with the alcohol, the illegal bootleg alcohol, went up sharply. Similarly, under drug prohibition, deaths from overdose, from adulterations, from adulterated substances have gone up.
How would legalization adversely affect America, in your view?
The one adverse effect that legalization might have is that there very likely would be more people taking drugs. That's not by any means clear. But if you legalized, you destroy the black market, the price of drugs would go down drastically. And as an economist, lower prices tend to generate more demand. However, there are some very strong qualifications to be made for that. The effect of criminalization, of making drugs criminal, is to drive people from mild drugs to strong drugs.
In what way?
Well, take marijuana. Marijuana is a very heavy, bulky substance, and therefore it's relatively easy to interdict. The warriors on drugs have been more successful in interdicting marijuana than, let's say, cocaine. So marijuana prices have gone up. They've become harder to get. There's been an incentive to grow more potent marijuana. And people have been driven from marijuana to heroin or cocaine or one of the other, or crack, one of the other drugs.
Let us consider another drug then, and that is the drug crack, yeah. Crack cocaine.
Crack would never have existed, in my opinion, if you had not had drug prohibition. It was drug prohibition. Well, why was crack created? Because cocaine was so expensive that the preferred method of taking cocaine, I'm not speaking from personal experience. I've never touched any of this stuff. I'm speaking from what I've read in the literature. But the preferred method of taking cocaine, which I understand was by sniffing it, snorting it, became very expensive. And they were desperate to find a way of packaging
young
cocaine.
Entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. Of course they're entrepreneurs. Look, the people who are running the drug traffic are no different from the rest of us, except that they have more entrepreneurial ability and less concern about not hurting other people. They're more irresponsible in that way. But they're in a business, and they're trying to make as much money as they can. And they discovered a good way to make money was to dilute this crack with baking soda or whatever else, cocaine, whatever else they do, I don't know the procedure, so that they could bring it out in $5 and $10 doses.
Let's talk about that more in a minute, but with regard to crack, considering the fact that it's very addictive, and considering the fact that
that's very dubious. It is addictive, but I understand from all the medical evidence that it's no more addictive than other drugs. In fact, the most addictive drug everybody acknowledges is tobacco.
Well, let me rephrase that then. All of the information I've seen on it suggests that it is a drug which is very pleasurable.
Absolutely.
Let me put it that way.
No doubt.
And the effect of it is also very short.
Yes.
And it is very expensive because multiple doses cost a lot of money. My question is, if drugs were legalized and if crack cocaine were available at a low cost, could it not be devastating in that it is so pleasurable, I am told, that more people could get it and stay on it for longer periods of time?
Well, maybe. Nobody can say with certainty what will happen along those lines. But I think it's very dubious, because all of the experience with legal drugs is that there's a tendency for people to go from the stronger to the weaker and not the other way around, just as you go from regular beer to light beer. That's the tendency that there is from cigarettes without filters to low-tar filtered cigarettes and so on. So, but I can't rule out that what you're saying might happen, but, and this is a very important but, the harm that would result from that would be much less than it is now for several reasons. The really main thing that bothers me about the crack is not what you're talking about. It's the crack babies. Because that's the real tragedy. They are innocent victims. They didn't choose to be crack babies any more than the people who are born with a fetal alcohol syndrome.
And as you know, we are already experiencing epidemic proportions of that.
Many
one out
more,
of 4 babies going into one hospital, I can tell you, in Maryland, is addicted.
But I'll tell you, it isn't that crack babies are necessarily addicted, but they tend to come in at low birth weight. They tend to come in at...
and have drugs in their system.
And they are in other ways mentally impaired and so on. But you know that the number who do that from alcohol is much greater. So the same problem arises there. But now, the reason that's what bothers me. Now, suppose you legalized. Under current circumstances, a mother who is a crack addict and is carrying a baby is afraid to go get treatment, afraid to go get prenatal treatment, because she turned herself in as a criminal. She's subject to be thrown to jail. Under legalized drugs, that inhibition would be off. And you know, even crack addicts, mothers, have a feeling of responsibility to their children. And I have no doubt that under those circumstances, it would be possible to have a much more effective system of prenatal care, a much more effective system of trying to persuade people who are on drugs not to have children or to go off drugs while they have children.
Let us turn to the early genesis of your belief that the drug laws may not be working the way the nation would hope them to. Tell me about the elements that you saw early on that changed your mind or changed your way of thinking.
Well, I'm not saying changed. I would rather say formed my way of thinking, because I do not recall at any time that I was ever in favor of prohibition of either alcohol or drugs. I grew up, I'm old enough to have lived through some part of the Prohibition era.
And you remember it?
I remember. I remember the occasion when a fellow graduate student at Columbia from Sweden wanted to take me downtown to a restaurant where we had a Swedish meal and introduced me to the Swedish drink aquavit. This was a restaurant at which this Swedish fellow had been getting aquavit all during Prohibition. They had been selling it to him. And this was just after the repeal of Prohibition. And we went there, and he asked them for some aquavit. He said, "Oh, no, we haven't gotten our license yet." And finally, he talked to them in Swedish and persuaded them to take us into the back where the kitchen where they gave us a glass of aquavit apiece. Now, that shows the absurdity of it. During Prohibition, when I was a teenager, Prohibition was repealed in 1933 when I was 21 years old. So I was a teenager during most of Prohibition. Alcohol was readily available. Bootlegging was common. Any idea that alcohol prohibition was keeping people from drinking was absurd. There were speakeasies all over the place, but more than that. We had this spectacle of Al Capone, of the hijackings, of the gang wars. Anybody with 2 eyes to see. Again, I wasn't a great imbiber of liquor. I may have gone to a speakeasy or so, I don't remember, but I'm not saying I didn't. But I wasn't an alcoholic or anything. Anybody with 2 eyes to see could see that this was a bad deal, that you were doing more harm than good. Now, in addition, I became an economist. And as an economist, I came to recognize the importance of markets and of free choice and of consumer sovereignty, and came to discover the harm that was done when you interfered with them. As a matter of fact, there was no very extensive attempt. The laws against drugs were passed in 1914. But there was no very great enforcement of it.
That was the Harrison Act?
The Harrison Act.
Yeah.
There was no very great enforcement of it until after World War II, by which time I had been able to see the harmful effects of price control, of rent control, of other attempts for government to interfere with market things. So it never occurred to me
Was there
be
any
in favor
single,
of it.
excuse me, was there any single event, anything you happened to witness that made an impression upon you, or was it?
No, there was no single event. It was a cumulative effect.
Of course, you know that there are those who say that Prohibition shows us that when Prohibition was over with, alcohol prohibition, that consumption dramatically increased and that it would be a...
I beg your pardon. That's simply not true. That's not a fact. What is true...
It has been argued. That has been argued.
Well, you got to stop. You have statistically reported figures in the books on the amount of alcohol consumed. That went up sharply right after Prohibition. But that was illegal alcohol consumption. If you take, as I have done, a chart of alcohol consumption before and after Prohibition, alcohol consumption after Prohibition came back roughly to where it was before. And over the course of the period since then, if anything, alcohol consumption has been going down, not in absolute terms, but relative to the population and relative to the growth of income. For a time, it went up rather slowly, along with income, except with one exception. During World War II, it shot way up. But usually that's what happened during World War I. Of course, you never would have gotten Prohibition if you hadn't had all the young men away in France when the vote was taken, so that the women had an extraordinary influence on them. But the same thing happened during World War II. And then after World War II, it settled down again. And more recently, the consumption of alcohol has been going down on a per capita basis. So it simply is not true that there was a tremendous increase. So far as drugs itself is concerned, some years ago, Alaska legalized marijuana. Consumption of marijuana among high school students in Alaska went down. The Dutch in Holland do not prosecute soft drugs like marijuana. And they would prefer not to prosecute hard drugs, but they feel impelled by the international obligations they've entered into. And there's no doubt the consumption of marijuana by young people has gone down. And equally more interesting, the average age of the users of hard drugs has gone up, which means they're not getting any more new recruits. So the evidence is very mixed. There's no, but I have to admit that the one element of harm that the one negative feature of legalizing drugs is that there might be some additional drug addicts. However, I want to qualify that in still another way. The child who's shot in a slum in a pass-by shooting, in a random shooting, is an innocent victim in every respect of the term. The person who decides to take drugs for himself is not an innocent victim. He has chosen himself to be a victim. Mm-hmm. And I must say, I have very much less sympathy for him. I am not willing to impose, I do not think it is moral to impose heavy costs on other people to protect people from their own choices.
For us to understand the real root of those beliefs, how about if we just talk for a minute about free market economic perspective, that perspective, and how you see the proper role of government in its dealings with the individual?
The proper role of government is exactly what John Stuart Mill said in the middle of the 19th century in his essay On Liberty. The proper role of government is to prevent other people from harming an individual. Government, he said, never has any right to interfere with an individual for that individual's own good. Look, if you write the case for prohibiting drugs is exactly as strong and as weak as a case for prohibiting people from overeating. We all know that overeating causes more deaths than drugs do. Why isn't it perfect if it's in principle okay for the government to say you must not consume drugs because they do you harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not eat too much because you do harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not try to go in for skydiving because you're likely to die? Why isn't it all right to say, oh, skiing, that's no good, that's a very dangerous sport, you'll hurt yourself? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I would bet that former drug czar William Bennett, some other folks along those lines, would probably suggest that the present sale and distribution of illegal drugs is in fact an enterprise which harms another person, and the government has to step in to protect the vulnerable.
It does harm a great many other people, but primarily because it's prohibited. there are an enormous number of innocent victims now. You've got the people whose purses are stolen, who are bashed over the head by people trying to get enough money for their next fix. You've got the people killed in the random drug wars. You've got the corruption of the legal establishment. You've got the innocent victims of the taxpayers who have to pay for more and more prisons and more prisoners and more policemen. You've got the rest of us who don't get decent law enforcement because all the law enforcement officials are busy trying to do the impossible problem. And, not last but not least, you've got the people of Colombia and Peru and so on. What business do we have destroying and leading to the killing of thousands of people in Colombia because we cannot enforce our own laws? If we could enforce our laws against drugs, there would be no market for these drugs. You wouldn't have Colombia in the state it's in.
In a very important sense, is it not true that the entire discussion here, the entire drug problem, is an economic problem?
No, it's not an economic problem at all. It's a moral problem.
In what way?
The economics part of it is, I'm an economist, but the economics problem is strictly tertiary. It's a moral problem. It's a problem of the harm which government is doing. Look, I have estimated statistically that the prohibition of drugs produces, on the average, 10,000 additional homicides a year. It's a moral problem that the government is going around killing 10,000 people. It's a moral problem that the government is making into criminals people who may be doing something you and I don't approve of, but who are doing something that hurts nobody else. Most of the arrests for drugs are for possession by casual users. Now, here's somebody who wants to smoke a cigarette, a joint, a marijuana cigarette. If he's caught, he goes to jail. Now, is that moral? Is that proper? I think it's absolutely disgraceful that our government, supposed to be our government, should be in the position of converting people who are not harming others into criminals, of destroying their life, putting them in jail. I don't see, that's the issue to me. The economic issue is strictly, the economic issue comes in only for explaining why it has those effects. But the economics reasons are not the reasons. Of course we're wasting money on it.
There are
10, 20, $30 billion a year. But that's trivial. We're wasting that much money in many other ways, such as buying up crops that ought never to be produced.
There are many who would look at the economics from the standpoint of looking at how the economics of the drug business is affecting America's major inner cities, for example.
Of course it is, and it is because it's prohibited. It's the government. See, the role of the government, if you look at it from a purely economic point of view, the role of the government is to protect the drug cartel. That's literally true.
Is it doing a good job with it?
Excellent. What do I mean by that? In an ordinary free market business, let's take potatoes, beef, anything you want, there are thousands of importers and exporters. Anybody can go into the business. But it's very hard for a small person to go into the drug importing business because our interdiction efforts essentially make it enormously costly. So the only people who can survive in that business are these large meddling cartel kind of people who have enough money so they can have fleets of airplanes, so they can have sophisticated methods, so on. So in effect, in addition to which, by keeping goods out, by arresting, let's say, local marijuana growers, the government keeps the price of these products high. So what more could a monopolist want? He's got a government who makes it very hard for all his competitors and who keeps the price of his product high. It's absolutely heaven.
Of course, you know that there are conspiracy theorists who suggest it's there for a reason, and that's because governments are in cahoots with the drug companies. You wouldn't say that.
I don't say that at all. You know, over and over again in government policy, good intentions go awry. And the reason good intentions go awry is because you're spending somebody else's money.
Many would say that a lot of your theories are grounded in the notion of personal interest, that it's in individuals, if it is in an individual's personal interest to do something, he or she will do that.
Absolutely. That's
not a theory. As you know, some people would say that...
That's not a theory. There's nobody who will deny it.
Okay.
Is there anybody who will deny that you can expect every person to pursue his own personal interest? Now, those personal interests don't have to be narrow. Mother Teresa is pursuing her own personal interest just as much as as Trump is pursuing, Donald Trump is pursuing his. But they're both pursuing their personal interest.
Some would say that that notion, that personal interest is what propels societies as well as people, is a heartless philosophy, and that the underclass would not fare well under that kind of a notion. You've heard that before.
Yes, of course, but the evidence is so overwhelming. The only countries in the world in which low-income people have managed to get a halfway decent level of living are those which rely on capitalist markets. Just compare the quality of life, the level of living of the ordinary people in Russia and the ordinary people in, I won't say the United States, but in France, in Italy, in Germany, in England, or in Hong Kong. Compare Hong Kong with mainland China. Hong Kong, the question is here, every society is driven by personal interest. Mainland China is driven by personal interest. The question is, how is personal interest disciplined? If the only way you can satisfy your personal interest is by getting somebody that other people want to pay for,
or by forcing it down other people's throats at the point of a gun, I suppose.
If you can do it
extreme.
At the extreme, but that won't get their cooperation. You may be able to kill them. You may be able to take their wealth, but it won't create any more wealth. So the only societies which have been able to create broadly based relative prosperity have been those societies which have relied primarily on capitalist markets. That's true whether you take Hong Kong versus mainland China, East Germany versus West Germany, Czechoslovakia before World War II and currently. You cannot find a single exception to that proposition. So that Adam Smith put it best over 200 years ago when he said, the pursuit of people who intend only to pursue their self-interest are led by an invisible hand to promote the public interest, even though that was no part of their intention. Mr. Ford did not develop the Ford car for the public interest. He did it for his private interest.
But Adam Smith also saw a role for government. He also saw, for example, in the administration of justice, didn't he?
So do I. I am not a zero government person. I think there is a real role of government, and one of the reasons I object to so many of the things that government has gotten into is that it prevents government from performing its proper role. Here, a basic role of government is to keep you from having your house burgled, to keep you from being hit over the head. And because so large a fraction of our law enforcement machinery is devoted to the war on drugs, you haven't got that kind of safety.
But of course, there is clearly the argument that if the police come and pick up a person who is addicted to a drug and does not have the money to buy those drugs, then they're also taking a potential burglar off the street who's going to come and get my house, right?
They are, but there'll be more of them coming on, as we know. And besides, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to house them? Half of all those, or more than half, the majority of those people who are arrested are simply arrested for possession. They're casual users. The people who really create the havoc on the streets are as much the people engaged in the drug war, and they're engaged in the drug war only because it's illegal. It's a repeat of prohibition.
Let us turn in the final few minutes then to specifically what your vision is then. Under your system, if you could make a wish and have it come true, what system would that be? How would you legalize drugs? How would you go about doing that?
I would legalize drugs by subjecting them to exactly the same rules that alcohol and cigarettes are subjected to now. Alcohol and cigarettes cause more deaths than drugs do by far, from use. But many fewer innocent victims. The major innocent victims in that case are the people who are killed by drunk drivers. And we ought to enforce a law against drunk driving, just as we ought to enforce a law against driving under the influence of marijuana or cocaine or anything else. But I would, as a first step at least, treat the drugs exactly the way we now treat alcohol and tobacco, no different.
You know what Representative Charles Rangel would say?
Charles Rangel, I have heard Charles Rangel. He's a demagogue who has no relationship between what he says and the interests of his own constituents. His own constituents, the people he served, are among the people who would be benefited the most by legalization of drugs.
I say that only because
Charles Rangel is pursuing his own self-interest.
Forgive me for throwing out a name, but I just wanted to mention one typical response to that would be that If you treat it like alcohol, you're talking about full-page ads in magazines with cocaine. You're talking about television advertisers. You're talking about buying cocaine at the ballpark.
I beg your pardon. Television advertising is forbidden today for alcohol.
For hard liquor. That's true.
For hard liquor. And I say, treat this the same way as you would treat alcohol. So, presumably, such ads would be forbidden for this. But, of course, in any event, I'm not prohibiting anybody from reading Mr. Rangel, and his ideas are at least as dangerous as those full-page ads you're talking about.
What scares you the most about the notion of drugs being legal as
Nothing
like
scares
alcohol?
me about the notion of drugs being legal.
Nothing.
What scares me is a notion of continuing on the path we're on now, which will destroy our free society, making it an uncivilized place. There's only one way you can really enforce the drug laws currently. The only way to do it is to adopt the policies of Saudi Arabia, Singapore, some other countries adopt, in which a drug addict is subject to capital punishment, or at the very least having his hand chopped off. If we were willing to use penalties like that, well, would that be a society you'd want to live in?
Last question. You have grandchildren.
Absolutely.
You have a 2-year-old granddaughter?
Yes.
And her name is?
Her name is Becca.
Becca. When you look at Becca, what do you see for her and for her future?
That depends entirely on what you and your fellow citizens do to our country. If you and your fellow citizens continue on moving more and more in the direction of socialism, not only inspired through your drug prohibition, but through the socialization of schools, the socialization of medicine, the regulation of industry, I see for my granddaughter the equivalent of Soviet communism 3 years ago.
You firmly believe that drugs in this country should be legalized?
What have we been talking about for a half
I
hour?
say that as a concluding statement to just simply say in conclusion that we have heard for the past half hour exactly why Professor Friedman believes that drugs should be legal in this country. Are there good reasons? You be the judge. I'm Randy Page in Washington. Thanks for joining us.